very warm welcome to all of you to Catholic Theological Union. I'm Sister Barbara Reed. I'm a Dominican sister of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and president of Catholic Theological Union. And it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to this important conversation on reckoning with dangerous memories in the history of U.S. Catholic women's religious life. This afternoon's presentation by Shannen D. Williams is sponsored by CTU's Center for the Study of Consecrated Life. The center was founded at CTU in 2015 to serve as a theological, academic, and pastoral resource for engaging contemporary issues and realities in consecrated life today from a global perspective. CTU is a treasure trove of resources for the study of consecrated life, with 23 men's religious communities who are the corporate owners of CTU, and approximately 40 communities of women religious among our students, staff, faculty, formation directors, and supporters. We hope you will join us often for conversations like these, or take a course at CTU. Please explore our website at ctu.edu for all our offerings. I'd like now to welcome and introduce Sister Chioma Ahanihu, a sister of the Living Word, who is director of the Center for the Study of Consecrated Life, and who will tell you more about the center's current project, for which we are very grateful to the Hilton Foundation for its support of this project. And tonight's presentation is part of this larger project. Sister Chioma will also introduce to us our esteemed speaker tonight. So, Sister Chioma.
And welcome to both our online participants from different parts of the world and to you here at CTU this evening. In gratitude to the Hilton Foundation, the current CSOL project is titled Moving Along the Arc, Women and Men Religious as Agents of Reconciliation and Transformative Action Towards a More Racially Just Church and World. With this grant, and together with the National Black Sisters Conference, the Center for the Study of Consecrated Life at CTU began a conversation about the role of religious life in addressing and dismantling racial injustice ad intra and ad extra. CSOL collaborated with the NBSC on a webinar series and has only begun to scratch the surface of the potential that this partnership holds, including widening the circles of experts and dialogue partners for this project through the NBSC networks. This grant has provided an opportunity for CSOL to partner with some congregations in developing issues of racism and transformative justice. This past summer, the participating congregations were engaged in a retreat here in Chicago, and we are also providing educational sessions on issues of racism, which includes today's event. We can only achieve this goal of dismantling racism through everyone's involvement, both through prayer and your cooperative support. As consecrated people and people of faith, we believe in the power of a loving God who continues to provide us with intellectual people like Dr. Shannen Williams, who devote their lives to research on this subject. Being able to introduce a renowned scholar to you today, whose work has not only lit the halls of academia, but also the rich fabric of our common past, is a true honor and privilege. Dr. Williams will be talking to us about her findings on religious congregations, on which her PhD research and book are focused. She will help us understand the historical facts about our Black sisters, over the past 2 decades. She seeks to give voice to our Black sisters, weaving their stories into the very fabric of our communal understanding. In a world where diversity is our strength, her work stands as a testament to the importance of recognizing and celebrating the contributions of every member of our community. She's not new to CTU, and we thank her for being here today as we learn from the wealth of her knowledge and wisdom. Without further ado, please join me in extending a warm welcome to the brilliant scholar, researcher, and advocate, Dr. Shannen D. Williams.
Thank you so much, Sister Chioma, for such a generous introduction. And thank you all for joining us this evening. It's really a privilege to be in community with you. Before I begin my formal remarks, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of tonight's sponsors, as well as all of the faculty and staff who played a part in making tonight's presentation possible. We can pull up the PowerPoint. In 2016, I delivered the Father Augustus Tolton lecture here at the Catholic Theological Union. And I distinctly remember that experience proved to be an important turning point in my intellectual journey through Black sisters' history. At the time, I wasn't sure that I was actually going to be able to successfully transition my dissertation into my book. And then about a few months later, I received an invitation to deliver a talk at the annual meeting of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. And from that particular experience, several doors opened, and one eventually in which I saw the light at the end of the tunnel. Indeed, when I began this project, I was simply looking to recover what I thought were Black sisters' hidden histories and insert them into the gaps where they would nicely fit in the history of women's religious life. Obviously, over the course of time, I came to realize that telling Black sister stories demanded a radical confrontation with the church's mostly unreconciled histories of colonialism, slavery, and segregation. I was forced to accept that their story, the story of America's Real Sister Act, was a dangerous memory for the Catholic Church, not only for their uncommon faithfulness in the face of unholy discrimination, but also because their lived experiences prove that women's religious life in the Roman Catholic Church, including in the United States, was a stronghold of racial segregation and white supremacy. I had to come to understand that narrating Black sisters' history would make me very uncomfortable. Telling their stories meant acknowledging that widely accepted arguments and histories about US women's religious life oftentimes proved to be myths. And indeed, I had to continue to go forward despite my fear. And what I came to realize was that scholarly and popular narrations of the history of women's religious life was not only a minefield of half-truths, silences, and misrepresentations designed to obscure and even erase the church's long-standing commitment to white supremacy and exclusion, but in many ways, those stories had become weaponized to silence Black sister stories and their lived experiences in the church. Earlier this year, I read an article in America Magazine that helped me to understand and in many ways confirmed what historians of the Black experience had always understood, that the greatest weapon of white supremacy had never been violence, but rather an ability to erase the history of its violence and its victims. That particular article focused on a decision made by the Sisters of Charity of New York to decide to begin a process of completion for their community. And in response, there was an article published reflecting on their lives and their history within the church. That article in particular included a statement specifically about the birthright of the Sisters of Charity. It argued that theirs was a loving commitment to service, especially to those living in poverty. Indeed, when one stood in their presence, you stood with those who they served. And in fact, the writer stated, quote, "They called to mind for me the words of John Baptist Metz, who spoke of the importance of holding the dangerous memory of the marginalized poor, of bringing awareness to rattle the doors of the church. These sisters who meld mission with ministry to those in need are giants who shake the conscious with all hearts to see." And I was struck by that description of the community, and in part because I was aware of that history's roots in slaveholding, but also their practices of racial segregation and exclusion in their institutions, as well as in their ranks. In fact, I was deeply aware of an 1853 letter that had been sent by an African-American laywoman named Harriet Thompson, who wrote the Pope in response to the fact that the Sisters of Charity in New York City had refused to educate the city's colored Catholic children, that they had excluded them solely on the basis of race. I was also keenly aware of that particular community's practices of racial exclusion in their ranks, and indeed in the fact that they had in fact formed a segregated all Black community in the Bahamas that in many ways had been erased from their history. And I began to confront what continues to come back to me to be a guiding story and a guiding question in my journey in Black women's history. And that, of course, is what happens when we narrate the story of the US Catholic experience from the perspective of Black women and girls. I also went back to the first article that I encountered, which represented the first attempt to write a history of Black women religious in the United States. It was an article written by Dr. Shawn Copeland, who then was in religious life and known as Sister Mary Shawn Copeland, serving as the executive director of the National Black Sisters Conference. In 1975, in an article for the National Catholic Reporter, she wrote, quote, that the saga of America's Black women who've dared to be poor, chaste, and obedient is largely untold. It is an uneasy story, not only because it is rooted in the American dilemma, racism, but also because the position of a woman in an oppressed group is traditionally delicate and strategic. And when I came back to this particular argument, I realized that at the beginning of my project, I had not fully understood what she was saying. I thought in itself, she was underscoring the importance of simply telling Black sister stories. What I came to realize over the course of my research was that she was also reflecting a deft understanding, specifically of the ways in which mythologies of white sisters and their commitments to social justice and racial justice could be used to weaponize and silence critiques of their practices of white supremacy and exclusion. Indeed, when I read that article in America Magazine, I did not want to respond. I did not want it to be me, because I always felt that it was me. But I also had to recognize that I had made an ethical and moral commitment to telling what Servant of God, Sister Thea Bowman, called us to do, and that was to tell a true truth. That half-truths could not get us to the point of reconciliation, let alone acknowledging justice, reconciliation, and ultimately the goal of peace. And indeed, when Black sisters came together in 1968 to tell their stories and form the National Black Sisters Conference, they helped us to understand that they themselves knew that they were taking a great risk. Indeed, when their chief architect, Sister M. Martin de Porres Gray, Pittsburgh's first Black religious sister of mercy, articulated that to be celibate, Black, and committed gives promise and danger to life, she understood the great perils of Black sisters' historical truth-telling. Over the course of my research, I came to understand that their stories constituted a hidden chapter in the long African-American freedom struggle, a story that told us that Black sisters were never absent from this fight for racial justice, human dignity, and bodily integrity. And indeed, in telling their stories, I also had to tell the stories of white sisters. It was an impossibility to try to tell those stories without it. And certainly when we go back and look at these dangerous memories, it calls us to ask new questions of sources that many scholars have had access to for decades. Certainly one of the richest repositories, two of the richest repositories of Black Catholic women's history and Black Catholic history in the United States are the archives of the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the Sisters of the Holy Family. They are the nation's and the modern world's first two successful Roman Catholic sisterhoods established for and by women of African descent. They are the oldest of 8 Black sisterhoods that we know were organized in the United States. And those two orders account for more than 70% of the Black women and girls who entered religious life in our nation. Those congregations also operated schools, including the nation's 2 oldest historically Black Catholic academies, initially established for girls, that have educated thousands of Black youth from 1828 to the present day. Their records document the African foundations of U.S. Catholicism, the transnational dimensions of African American Catholicism, and the central roles that Black women and girls played in the making of U.S. Catholicism from the earliest days of the church to the present. Their records include their members' applications to religious life, the recommendation letters from their spiritual directors, their baptismal and confirmation records, family photos, which include images of Black Catholics who were formerly enslaved by the church, manumission records for formerly enslaved members, congregational and newspaper obituaries, and a host of other resources, including administrative and personal correspondence, documents that foreground the church's commitment to white supremacy and exclusion. Certainly, though, before we even get to the history of the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the Sisters of the Holy Family, we know that so much of the history of Black women religious actually begins and can be found in the archives of their white counterparts. Indeed, we know that although the Oblate Sisters of Providence are the first successful Roman Catholic sisterhood open to Black women and girls in the nation and in the modern world, we know that there were Black women who felt called to religious life prior to the documentation of the first successful Black women to profess vows in religious life. One of the first requests that we have found documenting an African-American request to enter religious life is in the archives of the Society of the Sacred Heart. In an 1819 letter, their US foundress, St. Rose Philippine Duchesne, in fact, notes that there was a priest who was hoping to send a group of free women of color from New Orleans to Missouri in hopes of allowing them to join her community in some level of a rank, although she would only accept them at a 3rd level rank. The archival records also documents the opposition of Bishop William Duberg, who advised Duchesne to only consider women of mixed racial heritage, and even then noted that they should be admitted to only a subaltern, a sort of subaltern profession. Correspondence from 1819 also documents the response of her foundress in France, noting that she should not make the foolish mistake of mixing the whites with the Blacks. You would have no more pupils. The same for your novices. No one would join if you were to receive Black novices. We will see what we can do for them later. The documentation also contained in the archive, the correspondence of Philippine Duchesne, also documents her commitments to white supremacy. Indeed, various letters reveal her anti-Black animus, her belief that Native Americans were superior to African Americans, but also documents the community's commitment to a violent form of enslavement. This community itself will enslave over 150 individuals. One letter from 1834 notes, in fact, that there was one woman who was taken, who was discontented to the point where, although she was purchased to cook but not paid for, became so furious that she threatened to kill, to burn the house, to throw herself in the Mississippi. We had to pay to keep her in a prison for a while. Since everyone was afraid of her, we had to send her back. These kinds of documents underscore the ubiquity of anti-Blackness and white supremacy and violence in these communities, upending the notion of a benign Catholic slaveholding, even by women religious. And another example, Philippine Duchesne documents and expresses her anti-Black animus, noting that I'm not there yet. The want of domestic servants has left me enough occupation in this land of liberty. It is very difficult above all for us to get help. Often an almost worthless Negro costs up to 3,000 or 4,000 francs. We must maintain them, and they are more difficult than the whites in our country. Besides that, the Negroes are subject to so many vices that we can hardly take responsibility for them. Now we have a good German worker with whom we are very pleased, as he understands very little of the language. He will not be so quickly spoiled. And it's important to note that throughout the correspondence, much of this animus, much of this clear commitment to white supremacy is also a part of daily correspondence about the day-to-day runnings of the community. And so it's a casual form, but again, documents the ubiquity of this kind of violence in these spaces. We also know in this particular community that they will continue to receive requests to enter religious life, so much so that Duchenne herself thinks about founding a separate community for African-American sisters. We also know that one of the rejected vocations is a woman enslaved to the community, a woman named Eliza Nesbitt. We know from her correspondence and correspondence written about her that she desired to enter religious life. And she also documents the anti-Black animus of the community by constantly repeating that she is not in fact of African descent, but instead of Native American descent, believing that that would allow her to enter the community. She is never allowed to enter, although we do know that she's allowed to profess basically an annual vow when she returns to the community. We also know that she is buried with the sisters. We also know from the historical record that she is a mother of Black Catholicism in Convent, Louisiana. We know that members of the Sisters of the Holy Family come to visit her in her deathbed. They take care of her. And when she dies, the communities in Convent come to pay her respect. So we know that she's nurturing vocations, even though she is never allowed to enter religious life. I think these stories, specifically those that have been documented, also again underscore the violent nature of slaveholding by women religious. Indeed, we know in the case of the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth, another slaveholding community, they in fact had an enslaved girl who in fact killed one of the Sisters of Charity, the sister of their foundress, Mother Catherine Spalding. We know very little about her. It doesn't seem like her name has survived. But again, it is these stories that remind us and help us to understand the context in which African-American women who feel called to religious life are seeking to enter a space that is inherently opposed to the very idea of a virtuous woman, and people who are committed to an institution that is violently committed to maintaining a form of white supremacy that degrades and defiles Black bodies. It's why the story of the Black sisters is so important. In the case of Venerable Mother Mary Lange, who is one of 6 African Americans currently on the road to sainthood, the chief foundress of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, hers is a story that reminds us that sisters did not have to participate in these systems of white supremacy and domination. The Oblate Sisters of Providence and Mother Mary Lange serve as the essential counterpoints to those who attempt to make excuses or downplay or diminish the slaveholding aspects or the slaveholding and segregationist practices of their white counterparts. The Oblate Sisters of Providence are not a slaveholding community, and they could have been a slaveholding community. Even more significant, we have documentation in their archives, including from the diary of their founder, Father James Jobert, documenting the resistance that they face. The Oblate Sisters of Providence are just the 4th order of sisters established in the Diocese of Baltimore, which is the nation's oldest diocese. And we know from the earliest accounts that the sisters themselves, although they are finally allowed to organize themselves in 1829, had been hoping to go into religious life 10 years before they meet Father James Jobert. He notes, quote, after meeting them, that for more than 10 years they had wished to consecrate themselves to God for this good work, waiting patiently that in his own infinite goodness, he would show them a way of giving themselves to him. These records are essential to us in documenting the dangerous memory of white supremacy in women's religious life, because although this document does not tell us who the communities were that rejected them, because they are the 4th community organized in the Diocese of Baltimore, we know who the communities are that precede them. They are the Carmelites in Baltimore. They are the Visitation Sisters in Washington, D.C., and they are St. Elizabeth Seton's Daughters of Charity in nearby Emmitsburg. And in fact, it has to be them. It's clear. And certainly what we know from the available historical record is that the community did not take any African-descended women in the 19th century and has yet to have an African-American member persevere in the community. And indeed, what we also know from the most recent biography of Elizabeth Seton, that members of the community also demonstrate a clear commitment to anti-Blackness. There is one reference to a boarder who eventually enters the community, trying to cheer up a sister by telling a gruesome joke about a Black woman who being buried in a trunk, an enslaved woman being buried in a trunk, noting, quote, I have a great many funny anecdotes to tell you about monkey tricks, she added cheerfully. While the author notes such carelessness was the necessary handmaiden of racial slavery, I would argue that this is not carelessness. This is a demonstration of an insidious commitment to white supremacy within women's religious life that was not deemed to be disqualifying for white sisters in women's religious life. Also from the records of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, we have a clear documentation of the opposition that Black sisters face, also from the clerical community, also slaveholding communities, in the same way that the Sisters of Charity, the Visitation Sisters, and the Carmelites were slaveholding communities. Father James Jobert wrote, quote, I knew already that many persons who had approved of the idea of a school for pupils disapproved very strongly that of forming a religious house, and could not think of the idea of seeing these poor girls, colored girls, wearing the religious habit and constituting a religious community. In fact, we know that there are members of the slaveholding elite, the hierarchy, who describe the organization of the Oblate Sisters of Providence as a, quote, profanation of the habit. Despite that, the Oblate Sisters of Providence are also the first U.S. Catholic sisterhood to reject the racist and sexist notion that a woman born into slavery lacked the virtue necessary to enter religious life. They admit at least 8 women born into slavery into their ranks before the federal abolition of slavery in 1865. And again, they serve as that essential counterpoint to those who attempt to excuse the slaveholding and segregationist practices of their white counterparts. The Oblates, again, could have been a community that was a slaveholding community, and they choose not to do so. In fact, we know that their archive also maintains the manumission records of those members who were born into slavery. And this is one, Sister Marie West, and her manumission record. We also know that they are preserving the records and the vocations of Black women who felt called to religious life, who felt called to a life of serving their own community from across the United States, and also from Canada, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The Oblate Sisters of Providence were always a multi-ethnic and multilingual community due to the anti-Black admissions policies of European and white American congregations throughout the Atlantic world. Oops. We also know that one of their earliest members also helps us to understand the critical role that free and enslaved Black Catholics played in building up the early church. Anne Marie Beecraft, who became Sister Mary Aloysius, whose name has come back to us as a part of Georgetown University's ongoing efforts to make reparation for its slaveholding past, is someone we should all know, and in fact, a Catholic sister that everyone should know, in part because we know that she is the paternal granddaughter of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who is the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, one of early Maryland's largest slaveholders, cousin to Bishop John Carroll, who was the nation's first bishop, and an early beneficiary to the church. Her story appears in the first National Record Report on Education, published in Washington, D.C. in 1871, decades after she died. But people remembered her in part because she founds the first Catholic school for Black girls in Washington, D.C., when she's just 15 years old. She is described in this record as the most remarkable colored young woman of her time in the district, and perhaps of any time. It's in this particular record that there is a reference that indeed Charles Carroll of Carrollton may very well be her father's father, noting that he was born to a free mother who was a housekeeper of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who always had the kind intentions of this great man, and that there were now pictures more than century and a half old, and other valuable relics from the Carroll family now in the possession of the Beecraft family in Georgetown. What we know is that her younger sister marries into the AME Church, and it is in the biography, and it is in the first history of the AME Church, written by this bishop, that documents that indeed her father, William Beecraft, was, quote, the natural son of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, because that's his father-in-law. We also get a description of her the fact that she was also assisting the Visitation Sisters, but of course she can't enter the Visitation Sisters because she is a woman of African descent, which forces her to go to Baltimore to enter the Oblate Sisters of Providence. We also have other stories of these sisters, thinking about who some of these women are who enter into the community. This is the story of Sister Mary Gertrude Smallwood, whose father actually sort of participates in the 49er movement into California, who comes from a distinguished family of educators, a brother who was a secretary to Salmon P. Chase, the US Supreme Court Justice. Her father was a Catholic delegate to all the colored conventions of the 19th century. And another brother was the first African-American educator and founded the first school in York, Pennsylvania. She herself also became a prominent educator in her community, reminding us that though her family wasn't Catholic, they put her in a Catholic school, she becomes Catholic, and then becomes a part of this community, reminding us that Black Catholics are never divorced from the larger African-American community despite their Catholic faith. In other instances, many of the women who enter religious life, especially into the Oblate Sisters of Providence, are descendants of the enslaved and free Black people from Maryland and other parts of the cradles of American Catholicism, Florida, Louisiana, Kentucky, and Missouri. These are the Wade sisters. Their brother, Francis Wade, was one of the first 4 African-American SVD priests. They also had an aunt who enters into the Oblate Sisters of Providence, Sister Mary Josepha. Their mother appears in the free records of the 1860 census in Charles County, Maryland. Their father was enslaved in Charles County, Maryland. And we know that they were likely enslaved by the Jesuits because the father has a brother named Gonzaga Wade. In the case of the Sisters of the Holy Family, theirs is also a dangerous memory. Their chief foundress, Venerable Henriette de Lille, is the great-great-granddaughter of Charles de Bruyere, who was the inaugural French royal engineer and an enslaved woman that he owned. We also know that this community is a community also attempting to escape the system of plissage, which was a form of concubinage that free women of color would have been forced into in Louisiana, where they were expected to sort of become the common law wives of elite men. Indeed, we know that the earliest members are products of this system of plissage that they themselves understand and view to be a form of sexual exploitation. Their first history tells us that all of the first sisters were the very first families of the city, and only one, Sister Suzanne Navarre, was a stranger from Boston. As for the rest, they were all natives of this state, but their fathers were all foreigners, some French, Spanish, or German. They were descended from the first settlers of Louisiana. They are also, like the Oblate Sisters of Providence, formed in response to the anti-Black admissions policies of the white communities ministering in Louisiana, including the Ursulines, who were also a slaveholding community, owning over 200 enslaved people, owning over 200 African Americans. Their history also documents the opposition they face, in part because they were not allowed to wear habits for the first several decades of their existence. And when they finally got the chance to do so, they faced opposition from white sisters who wanted to ensure that they would be recognized as being nuns of the lowest rank, despite the fact that they are the first sisterhood organized in the state of Louisiana. Indeed, their first historian documents that the Sisters of St. Joseph in the city persecuted them because they believed what we now know from the second written history, because they thought their habits were too similar to that of their lay sisters. And they wanted to ensure that the African-American sisters were of the lowest rank sisters in the city. Now, the Sisters of the Holy Family are also a slaveholding community. Records do indicate that at least 2 of the members own 2 or 3 people. We don't have any more records than that. We do know that they do not support the Confederacy like most white sisters who were white sisterhoods that were slaveholding communities did. It's also clear we don't have any sort of evidence of them selling sort of and trading in human flesh, but that is also a part of their history that makes them distinct from the Oblate Sisters of Providence. It's not until after the Civil War that they also begin to address that within their own ranks, although it leads to a split into the community. And indeed, the sister who is most responsible for ensuring that their first African-American member who had been formerly enslaved is admitted is the sister who ultimately leaves and joins the Oblate Sister of Providence, underscoring some of the anti-Blackness that also existed within the Sisters of the Holy Family, again, that was initially established as a Creole community and restricted to free and women of elite status. In the case of the third African-American sisterhood, This is a dangerous memory, in part because so much of the history of Catholic sisters in the fight for racial justice foregrounds and centers the stories of a handful or a minority of white sisters who marched for racial justice in the 1960s. It's important to understand that the first U.S. Catholic sisterhood organized an explicit protest to a Jim Crow law are the Franciscan Handmaids of the Most Pure Heart of Mary, established in Savannah, Georgia in 1916, in response to a bill that had been introduced in the Georgia State Legislature, which would have prohibited white teachers from teaching Black children and Black teachers from teaching white children, and it would have effectively barred African-American children from the Catholic educational system. In response, a white priest, after first contacting the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the Sisters of the Holy Family, who had no members to send, decides to organize a community and eventually recruits an African-American woman who had been a former member of a failed community in Convent, Louisiana, and a former novice with the Oblates to found the community. The records themselves are scarce because they do not have a formal archive, although again, the African-American press plays a significant role in documenting the early history of this community. The African-American owned Savannah Tribune gives us the names of the earliest members in this first photograph. Let me see if I can go back. Yes. We know Mother Theodore is seated in the sort of white habit. And we know that one of the earliest sisters was a woman from Cincinnati, Ohio. It is this article from the Savannah Tribune that documents these women's names and where they come from. And again, a reminder that the African-American sisterhoods preserve the vocations of Black women and girls who are rejected admission into the communities of their white educators, noting that the earliest members, one come from Cincinnati, one comes from Beach Island, Georgia, one comes from Atlanta, one comes from Aiken, South Carolina, and another one comes from Macon, Georgia. And again, it gives us great insights into not only the commitments of white sisters and communities that are ministering in those spaces, even those that are ministering to African-American communities. White sisterhoods that minister in African-American communities oftentimes prove to be the most resistant to the integration of their ranks, helping us and forcing us to ask questions about what were the purposes of their ministries and overall. Other communities like the Colored Magdalens, they are the only all-Black contemplative community that was organized, reminding us that prior to 1922, Black women who could not pass for white or who were not racially ambiguous could not enter or pursue a contemplative vocation. Examples of Black women who enter into white sisterhoods also give us profound insights into white sisters' commitments to white supremacy and exclusion. We do, interestingly enough, have African-American women who serve as superiors of white communities in the 19th century. The most famous example probably is Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin, who was one of the charter members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, who goes on to found the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in Michigan, which is the first Catholic sisterhood in Michigan. This comes about after Father James Jobert dies and the Bishop of Baltimore attempts to suppress the Oblate community. They are saved when a Belgian priest steps in, but members who may also hold an anti-Black animus decide to try to leave and eventually found a white community that would exclude people. The experience of Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin, who would be subsequently erased from her community's history, also gives us a sense of, again, these commitments to racial exclusion and white supremacy. And indeed, on the left, we have a photograph of her, although this is not the image that most people will see. It instead will be an etching based on the photograph. And of course, the photograph, the only photograph that exists of this foundress, is taken of while she's in exile when she has to leave her community and stay with the Grey Nuns of Ottawa, Canada. She's actually wearing the habit of the Grey Nuns of Ottawa, Canada, which is why you will generally not see the photograph. There are other examples as well, and in most of those cases, the dangerous memory, of course, is that in many of these cases where we do have African-American superiors in the 19th century, many of them are subsequently erased from their community's history or obscured in their community's history. This is Margaret Whiteman, Mother Mary Rosanna Whiteman, who serves as the superior of the Sisters of Charity of New York. We know from the oral history of the community and their only written history that she is described as the most hidden of the Mothers General. In fact, the oral history stated that upon her death, one of her successors went into the community in their archive and tried to destroy everything related to her, except a prayer book and a rosary. Obviously, a photograph survived. Examples of Black women who could not pass for white, who went into white communities in the 19th century, like their male counterparts, all had to leave the United States to enter communities willing to accept them. Such was true for Frederica Law of Georgia, Frances Johnson of Baltimore, and Mother Matilda Beasley, first of New Orleans and then later of Savannah, Georgia. In the case of the first two women, they were only allowed to become lay sisters in those communities. In the case of Mother Matilda Beasley, she comes back into the United States and founds the first community of Black nuns in Savannah, Georgia. Her story is also an easy one because when her community begins to falter, she is encouraged by the Bishop of Savannah to attempt to integrate with a newly formed community in the Philadelphia diocese founded by St. Catherine Drexel. And that is the community of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. Although she is described after having made the journey to Philadelphia with one of her assistants as a most saintly colored woman, it is in that moment that the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament that were organized to minister exclusively to the African American and Native American community take a vote not to accept African Americans or Native Americans. And what's interesting from the annals is that they had just accepted a Native American woman. She had been accepted as a house sister, meaning that she had been relegated to domestic service, but she had been admitted. But it is Mother Matilda Beasley, who is both of African American and Native American descent, who facilitates this congregational vote, and the vote in which the sisters say that they will not live with Black women on equal terms. What's significant about this story and about this report and sort of this evidence is that the community had for decades said that that was never the case, that the reason why they did not accept African Americans was because the Black superiors asked them not to do so, which was a profound untruth. And the records clearly document that. There are other examples as well of communities that accept women who can pass for white, generally under unique circumstances, and most often because people don't have ties to African-American family members, or when they indeed do accept African-American women who are racially ambiguous, not necessarily white, can pass for white, but simply non-Black, because communities will take Native American women, Latina women, and women of Asian descent. They oftentimes require that that candidate cut ties with their family members. We know that this happens over and over again. And in the case of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, we have archival evidence of one sister refusing to do so, which is one of their former superiors, Rebecca Clifford, who was given the opportunity to enter into a white community and then refuses to do so. And we also have a documentation of her saying so. And in particular, this particular episode is important because it gives us great insights into young Black lay women who feel called to religious life, but who are also rejecting the tenets of white supremacy, reminding us that this was a function and a feature of Black Catholicism, and specifically Black women's traditions of Catholicism. She noted, quote, that I should not have my mother visit me, I think positively wrong and not the will of God. My mother is making a great sacrifice and giving up her only daughter to God. She is doing it most willingly. Should I impose an unnecessary sacrifice upon her? My decision in this is that the white people have many to work for them, but the colored people have very few. They are my own people. And I think God wants me to give them the first place. And I don't think that I would be blessed if I were to do otherwise. And certainly the visual evidence from the orders, the Black orders, tell us that many African-American women steadfastly refused to turn their back on their own communities, the communities that had nurtured their vocations and had supported them. So we will have examples, particularly of Black women who can pass for white. There's an early Maryknoll sister who passes for white. She refuses to cut ties with her family members, and that's documented in the annals. We also have examples of Black women who are caught passing for white and removed from communities as a result of that. In the case of the Religious Sisters of Mercy, they catch an Afro-Creole woman passing for white in 1929 after someone writes in a Christmas letter to their superiors in Maryland, basically letting them know that they have a Creole in the community and noting that everyone in Mobile knows it. Her grandmother was of pure Negro blood and Black and colored. She was a student at the Providence Infirmary Training School, and at the time of her graduation, the feeling was so intense that she could not be given her diploma in public. I hope she's not already in the novitiate because I could not allow her to remain. And indeed, when you go through the records of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, it's truly dangerous memory after dangerous memory. This is Mary Louina Glenn, born Mary Louise Glenn. She is a native of San Antonio, Texas. She is the first graduate of the historically Black Blessed and later St. Peter Claver School founded by Margaret Healy's community, the Holy Ghost Sisters. She's the first graduate of that school to enter religious life. She enters in 1896, but of course she cannot enter the community of the sisters that educated her. Instead, she is forced to leave San Antonio and come to Baltimore to enter the Oblate Sisters of Providence. And this is true for many women, even if they could pass for white or not. They are directed to the nation's Black sisterhoods, traveling hundreds and even thousands of miles away from their hometowns to enter communities willing to accept their vocations, regardless of race. It's also important to underscore that the Oblate Sisters of Providence never have an anti-Black admissions policy, or racially exclusionary admissions policies in any of their institutions or in their ranks. That is different. In the case of the Sisters of the Holy Family, they initially have an anti-Black and anti-Native American policy, only including sort of Creole women. They eventually abolished that after the federal abolition of slavery. That's also true for the other African-American sisterhoods. So this is not a story of both sides doing an issue. Like, those institutions don't exclude anyone. And so with baptismal records, we get a sense to be able to recreate and understand who people are who are going into religious life. This is Octavia Falls. She is the sister of Dr. Arthur Falls, a great Black Catholic civil rights organizer. Their mother was a suffragist in Chicago. She becomes an Oblate Sister of Providence. We see families, again, descendants from the enslaved people who built the church in Kentucky, like the Burks family, who send 5 of their daughters to the Oblate Sisters of Providence. One gets sick and comes back, but the 4 remaining stay until their deaths. We have families like the Thomas family, who are in Akron, but by way of Lebanon, Kentucky, who are descendants of enslaved people who built the Holy Land in Kentucky. They are descendants of an enslaved woman named Mary Eliza Spalding, who was owned by the families of Bishop John Lancaster Spalding and Martin Spalding. Her son is one of the first 4 Black SVDs. Her son is Vincent Spalding, who later becomes the first African-American Trappist monk. We also get dangerous memories in reminding us of what the African-American sisterhoods did, especially when African-American communities faced tragedy. There are members of their communities who were the daughters or family members of people who suffered from lynching. In the late 19th century, an African-American professor at Langston College is lynched in Oklahoma. His family falls into poverty after the insurance company refuses to pay out. And no Catholic orphanage in Oklahoma will take the children. And so a white priest who is sympathetic takes them to Kansas, where the Oblate Sisters of Providence have orphanages. And one of the children indeed becomes an Oblate Sister of Providence. 25 years after they saved this girl and that family, we also know from their historical records, their diaries of sisters who served in St. Louis, that they also opened their doors to the survivor of the Tulsa Massacre in 1920 and 21. They have the names of several of the members, and also note that the family members were so terrorized that they asked the sisters to allow the youngest daughters to sleep in the same bed as their older sisters because they were so terrified. We have documentation of their own attack when they attempt to move into a white community in the 20th century. We also know that the Sisters of the Holy Family themselves go into Tulsa a few years later to establish and serve in the first Catholic parish that had been established in Tulsa, because the white parishes in Tulsa would not accept Black Catholics, many of whom had come from Louisiana and Texas. We also know that the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the other members of the African-American sisterhoods are some of the earliest foot soldiers to desegregate Catholic higher education, reminding us of that commitment to segregation in every area of the church. This is the first African-American graduate of St. Louis University, although she is not documented in any official records. This is Sister Mary Laurentia Short. We also know from their historical records that they are the first representatives of the church to teach Black and Black Catholic history within church boundaries, which make them distinct from their white counterparts who oftentimes refuse to teach Black history until after the Civil Rights Movement. It's also important to note too, in terms of the dangerous memories of Black sisters, is that they are not going to be those who were involved in operating Native American boarding schools. Indeed, with the impending federal investigations into these schools, one silence that has to be reckoned with is the fact that some of the children in these Native American schools are also of African descent. If you look at this image, this was submitted by the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration, who have apologized and are working to reckon with their own complicity and agency in that story, and was submitted to the Global Sisters Report. And as a historian of Black Catholic women and girls, the young girl seated, see if I can point her out. Do you see her here? This girl is clearly of African descent. I could sort of zone it in, but if you go to the zoom in, but if you go to the website, she is clearly of African descent. And we know that the Native American groups that are designated as civilized by the federal government are slaveholding communities. We also know that there is intermarriage between Native American communities, and yet children of African descent who end up in these Native American schools, who are also of Indigenous descent, have been almost erased from the story. And yet the visual record tells us that they're there, and are very likely also buried in many of these unmarked graves, like enslaved Black Catholics buried in unmarked graves at many of the earliest monasteries, seminaries, and mother houses in this nation. We have examples of Black sisters who are pioneering members of community being forced to profess their vows in segregated ceremonies. These are the first 5 Black sisters of St. Mary who were forced to make a segregated profession in 1947. We have congregational minutes and general council minutes documenting the fact that when African American applications are received, they are perceived as problems, with priests oftentimes attempting to use their influence to encourage communities to integrate, and in most cases, that not working out very well. We also know that some communities restrict admission to lighter-skinned Black women or those who are racially ambiguous. We also know that many communities hold African American women's history because members who did not persevere in those communities have their records closed. And so sometimes if they were documented in the African American press or the Black Catholic press, it remains the only documentation that we have of these women. We have other examples of women who are forced to pass for white in their communities. 2 of the earliest school sisters of St. Francis were forced to pass first for white and then later as non-Black Latinas in their community, or be forced to be punished for breaking their vows of obedience. This is Sister Lorraine Holly, who was forced to do so. And then of course, Sister Sandra Smithson, who recently passed away. These dangerous memories remind us that sometimes Black women had to wait 4, 5, 6 years to continuously apply to communities before they would be admitted. Such was the case of Joyce Williams of Chicago, who had to wait 4 years before she was allowed to enter into the Order of St. Benedict in Chicago. We have testimonies of Black women who suffered unconscionable racism and bullying within their communities. Such was the case of School Sister of St. Francis, Daniel Marie Miles, who served in Chicago for a very long time, as well as sisters who are still forced to leave the United States to enter communities willing to accept them, sometimes having to become fluent in another language so that they can enter communities accepting of their vocations. And I want to underscore that this erasure also prohibits us from understanding and recognizing the pioneering achievements of pioneering Black sisters in white communities, such as Dr. Frances Douglass, who was the first African-American faculty member at DePaul University here in Chicago, but is also the first African-American to chair a department at a historically white university in the United States, with us for a long time believing that it was Dr. John Hope Franklin, the great African-American historian, but also recognizing that she and Dr. Franklin became the heads of their respective departments the same month and the same year in 1956. We also ignore the fact that Black sisters were pioneering members and founded some of the earliest Head Start programs across the country, were marching for racial justice long after their white sisters departed the front lines of those movements. And certainly the dangerous memory is also documented in the memories and the recordings and the testimonies of people who benefited from the legacy of Black sisters. Since my book has been published, I have been contacted by former members, people who were educated by Black sisters, noting that, giving me the names of sisters who educated them, the names of family members who became sisters who were still alive, other people who had worked with Black sisters in various communities and settings who couldn't remember their names, but eventually it would come to them. People who asked if I had never seen the signature of a sister who had since passed away, that they had preserved the records in their own archives and would send them to me. people who remember visits by Black sisters to their homes, showcasing their commitment to those African-American children whom so many refused to educate, but also reminders of people who then went on to desegregate white Catholic institutions, such as Judge Arthur McFarland, who was educated by the Oblate Sisters of Providence in South Carolina, him sort of crediting the Oblate Sisters of Providence with his ability to be so successful at Bishop England High School, which he helped to integrate in the late 1960s, noting in particular sort of his parents who were not Catholic being invested in putting their children in Black administered Catholic schools, and also him crediting the Oblates with his conversion to Catholicism. Men who will tell you that the first time that they became sort of great sort of basketball players was due to, in fact, these Black nuns who taught them how to play basketball, with one man telling me, the first person I saw do a crossover dribble was Sister Paul. And that's why all of the girls and boys basketball teams at Immaculate Conception and eventually at Bishop England had been coached by her. And I tell you this story because it's important. Sister Mary Paul Lee is the daughter of John Aloysius Lee Sr. He is the second African-American graduate of the oldest Catholic high school in the nation in Philadelphia. His father, William Henry Lee, was one of the enslaved people owned by the Jesuits, and he would serve as the coachman between the Jesuits and the Visitation Sisters in Washington, D.C. He was also the first African-American to ever play in a Catholic basketball league. In fact, we get the story from the turn of the 20th century that his state basketball championship team, that there was an attempt to exclude him from playing because he was Black, but his teammates refused to allow that to happen. Upon his graduation, he took a job with the post office. But what he did in Philadelphia was to found all of these separate, all Black men and women, boys and girls, sports clubs, track, golf, swimming, you name it. So much so that he has a recreation center named after him in Philadelphia. I say that because his daughter then takes that experience along with her quality education into the Oblate Sisters of Providence. And you have not only Arthur McFarland sort of saying that she taught us and we use basketball to help integrate Bishop England, but also again, to ensure that they would have an all-around excellent education, both in the classroom, but also in athletics. And indeed, in the case of Sister Mary Paul, it's important to remember that although her father had that experience of his teammates supporting him, in her obituary, she made it clear to be known that when she played basketball in the 1930s, she was not allowed to travel to away games, that white sisterhoods who administered other sort of girls' Catholic basketball teams would not admit her. And she did not allow that to stop her. Instead, she trained the next generation to do so. I also want to note that although she was rejected admission into all the white sisterhoods in Philadelphia, it would be her niece who finally broke the barrier, specifically in Philadelphia. The last story that I want to tell in terms of underscoring the dangerous memories of Black sisters is a story that I cite in my book in chapter 3. And it's about a story of a Black Catholic nun in Chicago being assigned to an all-white parish in the suburbs of Chicago, and the mothers revolting against her. It appears in a story written by a white Catholic student who won an essay contest involving the Catholic Church and race relations. And that student was at that school and she remembered the experience. No one really knew who she was, but after my book was published, I was contacted by a white priest in Minnesota who asked me if I'd interviewed 2 former members of his parish who had since passed on, and he sent me their obituaries. And in the obituary of Dr. Shannen Tolbert Glover, I learned that that was her. In her obituary, she made a point to document what had happened to her because it had been erased in the history. And indeed, we see how Black sisters still call to us, even from the grave, to remind us of their dangerous memories and the ways in which they should shake our consciousness, that remind us that women's religious life was and arguably remains a stronghold of white supremacy and segregation, especially when you erase their stories or misrepresent their stories. Indeed, when I end with the quote from Sister Loretta Teresa Richards, as I do in my book, I initially always focused primarily on the fact that Black sisters, when they think about their legacy and what she thought about Black sisters' legacy, she simply responded that the Catholic Church wouldn't be Catholic without us, underscoring that they were the ones who understood, one, that Black lives mattered, that Black futures mattered, and that racism had no place within the church. But I also want to leave us with a different interpretation of this quote. As much as it means that it was Black sisters who forced the church to be truly Catholic, to recognize indeed that all lives matter, I also want us to think about this as an indictment. The Catholic Church would not be Catholic if it wasn't for us. It is an indictment to their white counterparts who rejected, who segregated, who enslaved. And that is the dangerous memory. Indeed, the question that I leave us with is this: as we move forward and as we continue to grapple, when white congregations who have histories of colonialism, slavery, or segregation begin to tell stories about themselves, and oftentimes only foreground those moments in which they perhaps were on the right side of history when it comes to racial justice, if they exclude or fail to acknowledge their histories of white supremacy, what is happening in this moment? Are we comfortable enough to become uncomfortable, to embrace true truths, and perhaps get to the point of racial reconciliation, justice, and peace? Thank you.